Some of you may have heard Larry's father, Robert Summers, passed away last Tuesday, which is part of the reason he wasn't here last Thursday. And I would just like to say a few words about Robert Summers and his contribution to the field of economics, because actually nearly everything we know, not nearly everything, but huge amounts of what we've done in this class have been related to knowledge that was created through the International Comparisons Project, of which Professor Summers was a key contributor for years and years and years. And as Isaac Newton once said, he saw further because he could stand on the shoulders of giants. Robert Summers has truly been a giant in the field of economics who has allowed us all to see further, particularly about issues of globalization. So I just want to say a few words about the substance of what he did. What was his contribution? So going back, if we look at an economy, there's stuff. Economies produce stuff. They produce some stuff like cars, they produce some stuff like houses, they produce services like haircuts, and they have governmental services like policemen. And part of the big question of the first half of the 20th century was, how do we think about aggregating this stuff so we have a comparable measure over time of how much stuff there is in America, how much stuff America is producing in any given year. So the concept of GDP was essentially invented, and people had to invent GDP. They had to say, how do we measure this thing? What is GDP conceptually? How do you add up the number of cars produced, the number of houses built, the number of policemen hired into a single aggregate? That was a really challenging intellectual issue, and kind of what emerged from that is the rules for adding stuff up were codified into something called the system of national accounts, where economists debated conceptually and empirics, and they started to build national accounts. And what they built was national accounts that you could sort of add up the total stuff produced in any given year, and you could divide it by the number of people, and you could have a kind of simple number of how much stuff per person was produced in this economy. Now, all of these rules are about adding up stuff in local currency units. So GDP per capita is in 2005 was $41,000 per person in the United States, and it was 31,181 rupees per person in India. So now we know stuff in the United States and we know stuff in India, and the system of national accounts tells us how to track stuff over time, but it doesn't actually tell us how to compare how much stuff really is that in India versus how much stuff really is that in the United States, because we got to compare cars to cars, houses to houses. Now, you might just think, well, that's what an exchange rate does, is we have to translate dollars to rupees. Well, there's a rupees to dollar exchange rate, and people trade at that exchange rate, and so we can just value GDP at that exchange rate, right? That's your first instinct. For some purposes, the official exchange rate is not a terrible metric for comparing India and the United States output, for some purposes. But if you think about it, the problem is we're adding up some stuff that's tradable, and we might have a theory about the prices of cars in the United States and the prices of cars in India, and our theory might be called the law of one price, which if there's no trade barriers, and that the prices should be equal except for transport costs. Why? Because remember our basic theory of free trade, right? If it's more expensive in the United States than what it costs in India and plus moving it, you'd move it and those prices would equalize. That's what trade's going to do. So if the official exchange rate kind of reflects the arbitrage across tradable goods, then comparing goods at the official exchange rate isn't a terrible idea. Okay? But what's wrong with the law of one price and official exchange rates as a way of comparing the total bundle of what economies produce? Well, there's a lot of stuff like haircuts. And here's a haircut in the United States, and there's a haircut. And there's no way to trade haircuts. And one of the things we know, or you definitely know if you were here at my lecture on labor, is that wages aren't equalized. So the labor cost of a haircut in India and the labor cost of a haircut in the United States aren't equalized by trade. So haircuts are like super cheap in India. I had a trade economist friend at the World Bank named Arvind Panagria, one of the world's best trade economists. And every time he'd go to India, he was Indian, he'd come back with a terrible haircut. And I would say, Arvind, that's a terrible haircut. And he said, yeah, but it cost 12 cents. And I say, yeah, but it's still a terrible haircut, and you've got to wear it on your head. He says, yeah, but 12 cents. So how do you equivalate sort of the total bundle of production in the two economies? Well, what you want to think about is what's the exchange rate for each of these items such that if we took it and converted the equivalent quality good, the prices would be just equal. There's some exchange rate. That would be the purchasing power exchange rate, where you could just buy the same amount of policemen at that exchange rate as you could buy policemen at that United States in that exchange rate, and would come up with lots and lots of exchange rates. And what we want is, what's the exchange rate of GDP? Take the whole bundle of what these economies produce and say, there's a price level in the United States of all these things. There's a price level in India of all these things. And if we've priced them, there must be some exchange rate between US and India such that if we transfer dollars into rupees at that exchange rate, we could have purchasing power command over the same bundle of goods. That's a PPP exchange rate, right? Now, you can now see what an incredible challenge this is. Because you've got to specify what are the things you're pricing. What's the quality of the things you're pricing? Are these the things, like, just imagine trying to establish the equivalent price of a TV in India and a TV in the United States. Is that a TV at Walmart in the United States and a TV at a specialty shop in India? What's the markets? Is it wholesale? Is it retail? Is it high quality? Is it low quality? So there was a massive exercise called the International Comparisons Project. It began originally with trying to compare incomes in Europe in the 1950s and incomes across the communist countries in the early 1960s. This became the International Comparisons Project in 1968. Professor Robert Summers, having joined University of Pennsylvania in 1960, joined the project in 1971. And the group of them around the International Comparisons Project, including Professor Summers, basically created what we mean these days by PPP GDP. When you say purchasing power, you are standing on the shoulders of Robert Summers. He did the work of translating conceptually what do we mean by this, and empirically how do we measure, and created over time first a kind of conceptual system for doing it, and eventually a massive empirical exercise was implemented in cooperation with various parties, which produced the Penn World Tables. The Penn World Tables are almost certainly the single most cited data set in the history of economics. So nearly every comparison or paper you've ever seen that talks about economic growth or its consequences ultimately draws on the work of Robert Summers. So moreover, his work through the ICP kind of became the standard. Eventually, after much resistance by the World Bank and the UN, because what's the amazing intellectual triumph is that this wasn't an official exercise. Private actors went out and became the standard that eventually got adopted by the rest of the world. So eventually, the rest of the world incorporated the ICP, and now routinely what every agency in the world does incorporates the conceptual and empirical approach pioneered by these guys. And now we have comparisons where we can say, you know, here's GDP in local currency units in the United States and India. We can talk about the official exchange rate. GDP in 2005 in India was only $707, but that doesn't take into account that stuff's really cheap in India. You can really buy a lot more with $1 in India than you can in the United States because labor is really cheap. Once you account for the relative price level, the price level of Indian stuff is really only a third in India of the price of an equivalent unit of stuff in the United States, which means the true purchasing power of what India produces on comparable levels is 3 times as high as you would think comparing official exchange rates, and hence we're able to compare, here's this sort of equivalent of the stuff that India produces per year in GDP to the equivalent of the stuff America produces per person in GDP units. And that, so we started the system national accounts, GNP and GNP, and building up its. This led to other national exercises like the US national accounts, which are all local currency. For international comparisons, this led to the group of Kravis, Heston, and Robert Summers building the ICP project. And every paper that you've ever seen on economic growth builds on this data. Every paper you've ever seen building on the impact of growth on poverty consequences. And so Robert Barrow's most famous and most cited paper by a factor of 2 comes from a simple application of Robert Summers' data. Mankiw's famous 1995 paper with 9,000 sites comes from relatively simple application of once Robert Summers had built the data using the data. Larry followed in his father's footsteps and in his father's data, used the data in DeLong and Summers, a very important paper about economic growth. Larry and I have written papers together called Wealthier is Healthier, where we look at the consequences of GDP growth on things like life expectancy. Again, without standing on the shoulders of Robert Summers, none of this that your professors are now doing at Harvard would be possible. So he has truly contributed to the economic science and to our understanding of the world in a deep and important way.